Please welcome Alison Holder, Blessing Omakwu, and Katelyn Jones for the next panel, The Future is Socially Responsible.
So thank you, Chimba, for the music. I think it was quite energizing, and I hope that energy, I know that energy will carry over into this conversation focused on social responsibility. And I'm honored and delighted to be here with two wonderful women to talk about this. Alison Holder, the Director of Equal Measures 2030, and Blessing Omakwu, the Special Advisor to the Executive Director of Global Policy at One. So thank you both for being here today. As I mentioned, and you all know, the premise of this panel is to talk about how the future is socially responsible. And in the world around us, it seems that social responsibility is everywhere. It's shaping how nonprofits and multilateral organizations function, and corporations are putting it ahead of profit. We heard ACLS speak to this a little bit earlier. The Business Roundtable, which consists of about 200 chief executives, declared in August 2019 that corporations must shift to focus on investing in employees, protecting the environment, and dealing fairly and ethically with survivors, not just thinking about shareholder profit. So in our conversation today, I want to kick things off by asking a somewhat basic question, but one that I think is really important as we move the conversation forward. What does it mean to be socially responsible? And you can speak to this particularly in your line of work. I ask that to both of you.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, well, so for Equal Measures 2030, social responsibility is focused on gender equality for us. And I think if we think about injustice, the fact that women and girls make up half the population and are systematically excluded from power in so many ways, and certain groups of girls and women more so than others. So for me, gender equality is a real test of the extent to which we're being socially responsible. And I think for me, the kind of most important thing is looking at whether we're sharing power. So in the way that Equal Measures 2030 works. A lot of what we do at the global level, we have major global organizations, including one is a part of a multi-stakeholder partnership. We have representatives from the private sector and others. But what we're really about is the work that we do with our local partners in, at the moment, 7 countries, all women-led organizations, looking at how can we mobilize the voice and influence of those global organizations, but to shift that power, funding, resources, support to our partners in countries. So social responsibility is about gender equality, one of the most basic injustices of all in our world, and it's about sharing power.
I think when we think about social responsibility in civil society, we often focus on the external, advocating with governments, empowering citizens, and et cetera. But as a Black woman who works in the development space, a Nigerian American woman, I've become really passionate about what I call introvism, which is the activism within the organization. And I think social responsibility within civil society means asking and answering a series of questions consistently, and I'll give you 6 of them. 1, mission. Are we doing the most good that we can for the people our mission has called us to serve? 2, diversity. What percentage of people within the organization look like the people we are advocating for externally? How many minorities are at the highest levels of the organization? How many are in the headquarters and not just in the field or in the African continent or in developing countries? Are they being listened to, treated fairly, compensated adequately? Resources. Are the organization's human and financial resources being allocated and maximized to deliver unique and demonstrable value? 4, partnerships. When we work with local partners and grassroots activists, are we being extractive or empowering? 5, accessibility. Can the people we are advocating for, and 2, understand the products we are creating? Are we being accessible with our knowledge production? And 6, transparency. Are we telling the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and to who are we telling the truth? I think for me, thinking about those questions and answering those questions is part of our social responsibility as civil society.
So thinking about social responsibility is critical to both your lines of work. I heard both of you speaking to elements of power, right? Whether you're empowering, thinking about sharing power, perhaps even, I would say, transforming the very idea of what power is in this world, especially when we're thinking about questions of gender equality. So why do you both think social responsibility has become increasingly kind of popular and important to society at large, whether it's consumers, corporations, other organizations? Why do you think in this day, why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I wish it was enough to say that these are kind of rights that have been on paper for decades or generations. I mean, we're not unclear about what the rights are that people are entitled to. That's very well documented. All governments have signed up to all of the basic human rights, including women's rights. But I think in some ways, even if it frustrates me, the arguments that actually tend to resonate more are the practical and the pragmatic. And so if you kind of want to go on what works, and I already mentioned, as we know, that women and girls make up 50% of the population, well, it seems like smart business to take that into account. We know that companies grow faster and more sustainably when there's more diversity, including women represented in the leadership. We know that countries grow faster and more sustainably when there's more equality of all kinds, more inclusion and equality of all kinds. So I think, maybe those arguments, the rights-based arguments, are incredibly important. We should never lose those, but let's also talk about how greater equality is better for everyone.
A couple weeks ago, a US Congresswoman said something. She said, when we see change, it's usually because one of two things have happened. Either people have seen the light or they felt the fire. And I think often it's either a result of light or fire that we see change happening. To think about the private sector, a popular example, the Gucci sweater that came out earlier this year that cost over $800 and was criticized for looking like blackface. A lot of people immediately began to condemn it online. Hip-hop community began to burn it on social media, and et cetera. And the company has since instituted this diverse and inclusive program and a scholarship program because they felt the fire quite literally. So I think it always comes down to those things. And we've seen it not just in private sector, but also in the public sector and in civil society. We've seen things like the Oxfam sex scandal that really, I think, cause all of us to reckon with how our internal structures work. And even at One, we've had our own share of public reckoning and our own internal things that have caused us to think about how we operate and why we operate and to change our structures. For example, at One now, we have what we call our Building Out One in Africa strategy, where we're really thinking about how do we empower the African voice, since that is who we serve, both within the organization but also externally. So I think the light or the fire are the reasons we're seeing change.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know in the gender equality space, or at least in the UN, where I have the most experience with these kinds of questions, there's always an idea, well, we have to put out the other fires first before we can talk about gender equality and that sort of thing. And then when the fire is something related to gender, then everybody wants to fix it. So I want to shift now to talk a little bit more about your specific work and your experiences. And Alison, this question relates to what you were just saying about the importance of kind of being practical and pragmatic. And one big part of being practical and pragmatic, I'd say in this day and age, is using data, right? Having the information to back up claims and arguments. So could you speak a little more specifically to why data and evidence are really important when arguing for gender equity and the policies that support it? And how is Equal Measures kind of working to make data accessible to all, to help everybody make these practical and pragmatic arguments?
Yeah, sure. So I think data is an interesting one because on the surface it can kind of sound quite technical or objective. The numbers are there or it's black and white. And actually, I think data is one of the most profoundly political elements. It measures exclusion. And when we have the data, it's harder to ignore who we're missing. And if people are excluded from the data, it's virtually impossible to secure their rights. So I think data is actually incredibly political. Two kind of quotes that have come up over the recent months and years of our work as Equal Measures 2030 that I think sum it up for me. One was from one of our partners in Kenya, a rural woman that works as a kind of activist and community organizer. And her simple reflection was that in engaging with policymakers at the county level or the national level in Kenya, when we have the facts, we are listened to. So there was a feeling of confidence and power for her that came with delivering the facts to decision makers. And another quote that came through an advocate survey, we did a global survey of people who identified as gender equality advocates or champions. And one of those people told a story about how she hadn't had a lot of experience working on gender equality issues. She came from a research background. And her reflection was that stories moved her, but data changed her. And I think that that's really sums up the power of data. We also did a survey of policymakers in 5 countries, and we asked them several questions about their perceptions of gender equality, how important gender matters were in their policymaking work. And we also asked them a bunch of questions about the scale of certain big challenges for girls and women in their country. And so we asked them, what percentage of the seats in your parliament are held by women, for example? Or what percentage of girls are married under the age of 18? And the idea was that they were sort of unprompted, supposed to give some estimate of the scale of these problems. And what the research found was that policymakers were almost entirely unable to even make an educated guess about the scale of really basic gender equality challenges in their country. And these are issues, the ones we asked them about, are ones for which data is readily available. So it's not that they shouldn't know. And I think if we asked a policymaker, how much has GDP grown in your country in the last couple of years, they'd be able to come up with something that approximated the truth. But they were virtually unable to gauge the scale of key gender equality challenges. So for me, that really reinforces the importance not only of ensuring we're filling data gaps, ensuring that the data includes those who are most likely to be excluded, but that we're using the data we have and sticking it in the front and faces of policymakers so that they can't pretend or they can't ignore the scale of these key problems. And it was in response to some of this survey work that we had done is why we created the SDG Gender Index. So that's a new index of countries' performance on key gender equality metrics. We just launched that in June. We measured 129 countries, including the US, on 51 different gender equality measures. And the idea is to create a really simple accountability tool that advocates and activists and champions from all sectors can use with policymakers to show where they're lagging, how they're comparing with their peers, and maybe the issues on which countries are doing well so that we can learn from that. The findings were pretty sobering. So we found that not one country had achieved gender equality. And we also found that 40% of the world's girls and women live in countries that were failing, that we determined to have a failing grade on gender equality. So some pretty challenging findings. But I think for us, kind of coming back to what I said at the beginning, creating the index and creating this kind of global level data set or accountability tool is just one step. The real key for us is working with our partners and with advocates in countries all around the world. We work with women-led organizations who have incredibly powerful track records of community mobilization and campaigning, and we're just trying to help plug in that extra little bit of fuel, which is the data, to help them make their case even stronger. So they're able to take the index data, add the knowledge that they have of the communities that they work with, add in other data sources that might be relevant to that particular county or community or country, and together bring a really powerful package of data and evidence to policymakers. It's that extra fuel for the campaigning that we know women and girls do so amazingly well already.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And I encourage people in this room, if you haven't looked at Equal Measures 2030, go to the website. It's super accessible and really easy to use, which is always a challenge with data. And I think it really speaks to the importance for your work to making it accessible and helping other people use it as an accountability tool. So I definitely say check it out. Now I know, Blessing, a big part of your work is also kind of using data and evidence. And I'm going to use a little bit of the language Alison just did. I'd be curious to know what roles have stories, right, and data played in especially helping others work towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal 5, or SDG 5, which is geared towards gender equality.
Sure. So speaking about maybe data in general first, and then I'll come back to gender. At One, we call ourselves first and foremost factivists, because we believe that all our advocacy must begin with facts. And we have what we call our 5P approach. So we use policy, we use pop culture, partnerships, politics, and I'm probably missing one, but I'll get to it. And one of the ways I've seen that work is in Nigeria. So I worked in our Nigeria office for some time, and we were advocating for health. There's a health policy in Nigeria that says 1% of our total budget should go towards basic health care. And for the longest time, it took about 10 years to pass that law, and then for the longest time, it wasn't being implemented. And how we really began to use data in this instance is first to analyze, do we have the right policy that we need on ground? And so we analyzed the policy, And then we said, how do we make this policy something that people can understand? Because it's a very wonky policy. It has a lot of technical language. I'm not a health expert, a lot of health language in it. So we began to work with civil society organizations that do satire, for example, to create bite-sized, just one-liners that we could put on placards or put on social media or create open letters with. And then we began to work with partners. And I think realizing our space in the civil society space makes a lot of sense, because sometimes we reinvent the wheel. And so making sure that we're working with a coalition or working with partners has always been really helpful for us. And we worked with about 70 partners in the National Healthcare Coalition. And then pop culture. We were co-founded by Bono, and so pop culture is a big part of the work that we do. And working with celebrities has helped us to take policy ideas that are very, very marginal and bring them to the mainstream. And some might call it sugarcoating, but for us it's important that we meet people where they are. If they're on Instagram, meet them there. If they're on Twitter, meet them there. If they're watching TV shows, meet them there. And so we worked with celebrities. We worked with the different kinds of influencers, social influencers, to really make this idea accessible. And then politics. We really believed that we had to work across the aisle. So in Nigeria, we worked across party lines and really just made sure that we really were nonpartisan in our approach. And for the first time, we were able to see that law become implemented. And so I think finding ways to use data like that has been important. But to your point about gender, a lot of my work outside of one, I founded an organization called the She Tank that focuses on SDG 5 in Africa. We've seen that in Africa, gender equality is something that has to begin with mindset change. It's great to have data, it's great to have policies, it's great to have all that, but the change really has to begin with conversation and mindset change. And what we've seen working is, number one, starting with conversation. I think we have to take some of these conversations outside of the legislature and begin to meet people in their churches, in their communities, in their homes, using popular culture. Popular culture is huge across the African continent. How do we use music and art and television and film? And so right now I'm working with a few people and creatives to curate an anthology, where we tell stories of women across all the SDGs from 1 through 17, humanizing what each goal means and showing why gender is important. I think when people see themselves in stories, then it becomes more clear.
Great, thanks. I think that example really speaks to, as Alison was saying, the kind of need for both stories and data in the process to create, to really create change. Going back to data a little bit, Alison, and you can speak to stories as well in your experience, what do you think are the biggest challenges faced when trying to make data accessible, really giving people that accountability tool, and how do you think these hurdles can be overcome going forward as Equal Measures continues to do its work?
Sure, yeah, I mean, there's several challenges, even just in building a tool like the SDG Gender Index, which is in some ways quite simple. Most of the data that's in our index exists. You could go to various UN agencies and find those data points. So it's even the effort of trying to combine that data into a holistic measure is actually incredibly challenging. Some of the things relate to, so there might be holes in the data, there might be things in the data that it's been published, but it actually looks strange, and you have to kind of figure out, is this defendable, is this right? So even just compiling existing data is incredibly challenging. And I think beyond that, so even if you say, okay, well, this is what's available and we'll compile it, and that's the first step, you really quite quickly confront how much is actually missing. I was on a panel on Sunday with the lead statistician from UN Women, and I think the stat he gave was that 60% of the indicators that we need to measure the gender equality dimensions of the SDGs are missing. So the UN has developed an official framework for monitoring the SDGs, but 60% of those indicators are missing, and we might think, oh, that's probably a problem confined to very poor countries that might have weaker stats systems, but actually I think he said it was that half the countries, there's no country that has better than half of the indicators needed to measure the kind of official gender elements of the SDGs. So the data gaps are really profound. And so that is a huge challenge. As part of our kind of surveying effort before we started our index of gender advocates, one of the questions we asked them was, what are the biggest issues that you're working on? What are you most commonly advocating on in the gender equality space? And the kind of top two, or amongst the top answers on that, was sexual reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, and another one that was near the top of the list was around unpaid care work and like the balance between the caring work that women and men do, which is imbalanced in every country. And so for all of those issues, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, and unpaid care work, we virtually do not have the data that we want in a way that you can compare countries, 129 countries. So some of the most important issues for gender equality advocates and champions are virtually missing. So we tried to get at it within our index on violence. For example, some of the indicators in our index ask women their perception. So what is your perception of how safe you feel walking at night? One of the indicators is around how acceptable is domestic violence? So in this country, is it okay for a man to beat his wife? And so we're trying to get at it from different ways, but we don't have an indicator in our index that really measures the prevalence of gender-based violence. So the kind of really confronting those data gaps is a major challenge. And I think, beyond the issues that are missing and the countries that are missing, because there are countries that are missing from our index because of data gaps, there's also a lack of disaggregation of the data. So as I said at the beginning, we can talk about women not having a seat at the table, but in every country, it's certain groups of women who are even less likely to do so. And we don't have the ability to break that data down to look at certain groups of women. In our index report, we tried to do that. We could only take, a spotlight on a certain country, and a certain kind of dimension of inequality, and you can really see the difference. So one of the ones we looked at in the report was in the US, if you look at median income, this will surprise no one, but if you look at median income overall for men and women, yes, women are overall paid less, but if you break that down by race and other characteristics, as we know, some women are much more likely to be paid less, not only than men, but than white women, right? So the data, it's the issues that are missing, it's countries that are entirely missing because the data systems are not complete or functioning, quite frankly, and it's the breakdown in the data by the different characteristics that drive inequality in each country. It's a huge challenge.
I look forward to seeing how Equal Measures deals with that going forward. I know these conversations are happening a lot at the UN, as you were just saying, as they try to figure out what metrics to use for the SDGs and trying to assess progress. So, Blessing, I want to go back to a point that you actually touched on when you responded to my first question, talking about the internal nature of an organization. So, as any equity, diversity, and inclusion expert would tell you, an organization focused on EDI, right, and in its external work can only really be as effective as it is at addressing those same problems internally. And I think you referred to this as intervision. Was that the word?
Intervism.
Intervism, yes, intervism. No, it's a good word. I'm going to steal it. So I'm curious, how are you what's your theory on that? Why, could you speak a little more to why it's so important to kind of address that internal focus and internal approach? And then what are you kind of currently doing to make sure the external and the internal align in your own work?
Right. I think the first part is why do this? Why is this important? So for the past year, I chaired our Global Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group at ONE. And I think what we found is even just for staff enthusiasm and motivation, they need to see that what we're preaching about outside, that we're practicing what we preach. I think it comes back to that very, very simple, are we practicing what we preach? And I think that enthusiasm, I think our integrity and our honesty matters. And so what we've began to do is, to look at our structures internally, to begin to develop policies, to create groups, to create advisory groups. For example, next month we're having a bias training. We're also having our speaker here, Stephanie, who's going to do a workshop next month for us called Decolonizing Development. How do we think about how some of our development policies are colonial, how some of our approaches are colonial? And it's a work in progress. As you know, also doing this work, it's not something that you accomplish easily. But we do it one step at a time, and I think we're getting there slowly but surely. Our Building on Africa strategy I mentioned earlier. Our focus on, our main vision is on extreme poverty. And because the data shows us that extreme poverty is on the rise in Africa, our focus has been on the African continent. And so now we're shifting completely our structure internally to think about how do we make sure that our Africa staff and colleagues are equal partners in the organization. But how do we also ensure that in global development debates, the African voice is elevated? For example, next year we're going to have Beijing 25. Most of you know about it. It's going to be a big moment globally. If we go back to the history of Beijing, many African women felt excluded from that conversation. They felt like the agenda was being set by the North. The people came and said, this is what we must talk about. We want to talk about FGM. And they said, we want to talk about women's economic empowerment. We want to talk about girls' education. So to think about Beijing 25 next year, how do we ensure sure that African voices are in that conversation, are centered in that conversation, are heard in those conversations. So it's that work of thinking about externally what our policies will be, and we're doing that right now, but also thinking about internally what our structures look like.
Yeah, so what I hear in both your response and then what Alison was just saying, whether it's using data for advocacy or making sure that our internal principles align with the work that we're doing outside, you really have to constantly be critical, right? And thinking about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and thinking about how the data actually aligns with or doesn't align with the questions you're asking and what are the consequences of that. So I think that kind of for me, and I think you both would agree based on what you said, it's that kind of critical attention to what's happening that pushes change and makes progress happen. So at this point, I'm going to welcome others into our conversation. So if anybody here has a question, feel free to raise your hand. There's one in the front.
So I know that you mentioned how a public policy is very important in gathering the data, but I was wondering about how companies and their effort at the private level provide an effort to support data that helps in gender equality.
Right. Do you want me to take that?
Sure.
Sure, yep. Okay, yeah, great question. So we have, as part of Equal Measures, we're a partnership. So one of the partners within our group is KPMG as a private sector organization. And so we're always trying to think of the different sectoral implications. I think there's several things. So for an organization like KPMG or so many others, as a company, it's thinking about what data you might have in the normal course of doing your business that might tell a story about the lives of girls and women in the countries in which you operate. So what does the data you have tell you about customers? What does it tell? Are you looking at the data within your own company around the percentage of women that are in leadership, that are on the board? So a lot of the internal data can also help us tell the story of broader discrimination and inequality. So I think that's certainly something. There's another kind of way that we see the private sector, even in a very direct way, contributing to our efforts. So KPMG is an organization that has huge data analytics capacity. That's one of its kind of ways it does business. So they're able to lend that to us to help us analyze more data. We also work really closely with Tableau, whose core product is data visualization software, and they do a lot of pro bono work with us to make the data more visually compelling. So all of the index data on our website is visualized using Tableau software because of the collaboration. So I think for me, and then I guess even the bigger thing in a way is thinking about how the private sector, the voice that they have, often the private sector doesn't like to think of itself as an advocate or lobbying in a way in that space, but private sector voice is incredibly powerful. So in the countries in every country, if policymakers hear the private sector saying, well, we're really concerned about, the low rates of girls finishing secondary education in this country. It's not good for workforce development. It's not good for, consumer development, whatever it is. The voice of the private sector in telling policymakers to do more is actually the most powerful contribution. So use data internally to drive change and do a lot of what Blessing was talking about, of like living the equality story within the organization. If you have products or services or knowledge or skills that directly can contribute to the effort of using data to drive change, and use your voice.
Thank you. Yep, we'll take that question. Thank you.
Hello, Blessing, this is for you. You mentioned something about doing some internal rethinking about decolonizing development. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
We're actually going to have Stephanie speak in a minute, and she's going to be leading that workshop, so I'm not going to steal her thunder.
Okay. Thank you.
I will leave that one for Stephanie because I think she'll break it down brilliantly.
Right, thank you. Yep, we'll take another question from the room.
Hi, Alison, this is for you. I'm Saumya and I'm from India. I used to work with this organization called Social Corps in India, and we worked with the UNRCO's office in India and the government and the Ministry of Statistics to create the national level SDGs dashboard for India, which is currently being used by the ministry and the Prime Minister himself. And one of the things that we really encountered, which struck close to what you were also saying about a lot of missing data existing, was the fact that, for instance, SDG 1, when we want to measure poverty, now poverty is reliably measured in India during the census, which happened last in 2011 and is going to now happen in 2021. So there's a 10-year gap. And when we're trying to measure that particular indicator, we're wondering how on earth do we put this data down, which is like nearly a decade old, and it's going to take another 2 years before we get fresh data. And one of the things we really struggled with was trying to find proxy indicators to sort of measure poverty or any of these other development indicators. So we were looking at, say, nightlight data to figure out how that correlates with poverty and things like that. So I'm very curious to know how you're approaching this. Is there a framework for proxy indicators to look at the data that we do have and see how that then relates to what we're trying to measure and to get to the closest measure of what we're getting at?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So I think several layers to my answer. One is that at the global level, we're even more constrained in the data because if I want to do an index that measures 129 countries, I need a data source that's the same for all 129. So I'm already dealing with a much more limited pool of data. Even at that global level, the timeliness of the data, how new it is, was a big constraint. And we wanted to ensure, we tried to choose indicators that were kind of 2015, which was when the SDGs were signed at the UN, around 2015 or newer. And we tried to stick to that, but it was really tough. So some indicators that we might have had that were older than that, we didn't use, even though they were a good indicator. So I think it is an incredibly challenging issue. And often people will say to me, oh, this is great, we love your index, why won't, you should update it every year, or you should have like a real-time tracker, showing, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I hear you, but yeah, we're going from real-time trackers to 10-year census timeline. So it's a big challenge. I think getting away from the global level where we're really constrained and trying to find very comparable data, when you look at a country like India that does have great data, it's still an incredible challenge. And I don't have an answer for that. We have a local partner in India called Sahaj, and all I can say is the way that they try and tackle the issue is by using what data is available and bringing more local level data and their experience of working with communities to add color to that. So that's the only way we've gotten around it, is trying to combine the kind of official sources with other indicators. There's so much. If you look at project evaluation research, if you look at state level data, if you look at like municipal level data held by the Chamber of Commerce, like there's a lot of other sources that people can pull in, particularly if you're working within India or within particularly one particular state or community. You really have a bigger basket of data options. I think in our index, so when we originally set out to make the index, we could have just taken the official framework that the UN has developed. So they've looked at the SDGs and they've figured out the 260 some odd official measures. But actually so many of those don't even exist. So there is no established or accepted way of measuring that thing. So we had to do a lot of work in thinking exactly like that about what are the proxy measures. Out of our 51 indicators in our index, I think 65% of them are actually not the official UN indicators because we had to think creatively. We're using data from Gallup, a kind of private sector polling company. We're using data that NGOs and think tanks and others have put together. So I think it's all around presenting what's there and then thinking about what other sources might exist that can give you some insights into the issue. And complementing that with local knowledge, and that's why we always, our partners lead the work and can bring their experience of working within communities.
Okay, so I'm going to take one of the online questions. So I'm going to broaden it a little bit. I'll ask the original question. It says, how do you help ensure that corporations addressing EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, are not simply marketing, but are making lasting, impactful change? I think that's true of corporations. I think that's true of any organization. Blessing, I'd be especially curious to get your thoughts on this.
I think the first thing is always checks and balances. I think you have to have in place a system of accountability internally. So for us, it started out with having a staff advisory group where we held our leadership accountable. We said, you've made XYZ promises, when will this be delivered, when is the timeline? And it's difficult work doing that. But I think keeping that kind of check and balance, and I think it speaks to our leadership to be able to have those kind of systems internally, to have that. I think our board, how does our board also keep us accountable as an organization matters. Also our stakeholders, when we do projects, how are we doing our monitoring and evaluation? Are we asking the people that we've worked with, did this serve you? Did this empower you? Or how did this feel working on this project? Was it extractive? I think asking those difficult questions has been something that's been very, very important for us. So I think that process of question and answer, of consistent review, and of always making sure that you have those checks and balances have been important.
Alison, do you have any thoughts? I know you were talking about working with KPMG before based on your interaction with the private sector corporations. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it comes back to partly what Ala said earlier in the morning, which is like, use the power you have. So companies need, doesn't matter what kind of company it is, what they're selling or doing, they need to attract talent. And if people don't want to work for companies that are, washing in some way what they're doing, that will ultimately, so that's a bit of a longer term thing, but, choose to work for companies that you believe in, that they're walking the talk, buy things from companies in the same way. And I think, ultimately, like, I love that, the heat and the fire, or the heat and the light. So I think it's thinking about how can you use your power to reward the companies that you really believe in, and not do so for companies where we think they're trying to get away with things that don't work.
Yeah, so there is some power for the consumer, right? And encouraging corporations, especially, to create that.
Employees, I mean, I think employees are huge. Like so many companies that I talk to, that's actually the driving thing that's gotten them to want to talk to us, is that their employees are clamoring for them to do more. And they're saying, a lot of companies are using the SDGs to structure their citizenship activities, for example. And they're saying our employees are saying they want to see us do more on SDG 5, for example. The employees are rallying around that. And that's, I think, something that matters for every company, is retaining good talent.
Right. Yeah, that advisor group idea, for example, as you just mentioned, I think is a great one, right? Ways for employees to work together to hold management responsible, and then think about how the board is holding you accountability, that sort of thing. I think it's a good idea that speaks to that. Are there any other questions in the room? I know I saw hands before. Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Rosario. I'm from Peru, and I have a question. So we are talking about data and how important it is. But then, in the other hand, we have, or the context or the reality show us that we have a lot of data that is not being used by citizens, by local authorities or local social actors, which are at the end the ones that really face, the different challenges of societies. So the question is how you have experience, or if you have worked any strategy to engage citizens or local actors in the process of collecting data, so there is a sense of ownership that is generated by the community, and they actually know where they are standing and how they can advocate for their own development. On the terms of the 2030 Agenda, there was a process called the My World Survey 2015, a worldwide survey that actually engaged 9 million people on collecting data from their communities. This generated a huge movement of local stakeholders that at that moment were pushing hard for the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, and nowadays they are still working on there. So having that experience, then I go back to the question, how or what do you recommend? If you have done it, how did you do it? And what would you tell us maybe to take as a suggestion for our work back home? Thanks.
Great, yeah, happy to. So everything that you say is a big part of the foundation of how Equal Measures 2030 works. So we talk a lot about our index because that's kind of a global product, but most of what we do with our time and money is working with local partners. And what that looks like at the moment in 7 countries is identifying a women-led organization or movement who is campaigning on an issue or to change a law, and that we can just contribute. We contribute funding and technical support and helping give global platforms and other ways of advancing their advocacy, is to contribute data as a piece of that. So an example is is our partner in Indonesia is a women-led organization. They've been working for 30 years. They work within communities and they bring women together to understand their rights, and pretty kind of traditional sort of women's groups in that way. But what they've always done is that a part of their women's groups is that those women become poll takers or survey takers. And through the efforts of surveying their community, it helps them become aware of the scale of the problems, but it's also really important in becoming aware of your rights. So by asking other women questions in your community, that process of taking data and sharing data together is empowering in itself, is the model that our Indonesia partner works on. Similarly, in Kenya, it's a network of grassroots rural women who they worked together in the early days because the HIV and AIDS crisis was so profound for the women in the community, and that brought them together. And now they've evolved, they're advocating together on land rights and clean energy and all sorts of other issues. So it's the women together, and their power as members of a community is the starting point, and the issues that they choose to work on evolves depending on what the biggest challenges are. And so for us, it's just trying to plug that piece, that element of data into what they're already doing. We try and support where the energy already is, where the community networks already are, where the campaigning energy is, and we're just helping them add that piece of data in. I think actually for a lot of our partners, collecting local level data is a default. It's something they go to that strategy quite quickly, which is fine, and some of our partners use our funding for that, but what we're trying to get them to do is to plug that into a bigger story. So you might be collecting very local level data on a particular issue in a subset of communities. Now combine that with the fact that your government signed up to the SDGs and actually aren't doing very well on this index, because now you've got a more powerful accountability story rather than just a small scale survey in a certain community. I think it's the two together that are very powerful, and a lot of our partners do exactly that.
So we don't have time for another question, but Blessing, I'd love to get your thoughts on this question.
Sure. I mean, I think one quick thing is, as we think about what the future looks like, we need to begin to think about how do we take our knowledge outside of our little hubs and take them to people who need them, citizens and government. So many times, many of the products that we create, people do not understand. I know that even, I grew up partly in Nigeria. There are certain American words that took me a minute to understand. What does a deck mean? I knew what a PowerPoint was, but what is a deck? What is a scorecard? I just learned what a and I've been in the policy space for a while. I know what a report card is. So even words sometimes can be barriers. And how do we begin to think about how do we use words that invite people in? How do we begin to not also force people to become accustomed to our product, but to meet them where they are? So if I'm thinking about public servants in Africa, for example, a lot of times I have to go and think about what language will work for them. Is it taking this big report that they're never going to read? Or is it maybe taking a story and then adding a sentence here or there, or what will work there? I think thinking about the future, how do we use social media as well is something. How do we take Instagram and make data something that is fun and accessible? I think if we can think about taking all these big reports out of the way and meeting people with what they understand, we'll begin to talk about what the future really looks like for development.
Yeah, so it seems like for a socially responsible future, we need data that is accessible and that allows, and that is available to be used as an accountability tool, really, going forward. Yeah, so thank you so much for your insights. I look forward to continuing this conversation the rest of today, and thank you all for joining us.